right, let's pick up where the last video ended. I realized how long the last video was, and so I've never taught this course online before. I've never taught anything online before, except for last term. So if we were on campus, we would have a long 3-hour block, and we would cover all this material in one go with some breaks and some discussion, and it wouldn't feel quite so long. But that first part took a long time, and it doesn't seem reasonable to make them one long video. So I will, learning as we go, I will make this week's video lectures 2 parts. So this is part 2, that one is part 1. When I started the last video, I didn't realize I was going to make 2 parts. I also didn't realize how long I was going to talk for. But here we go. So now we can, you've had the last one, you take a minute, and now we'll talk about what culture is and how we actually do anthropology. And once we have these nuts and bolts under our belt, that's when we can move into the rest of the term, where we are really thinking about examples of how we use culture to adapt to our physical environments to meet our basic needs. How do we move goods and services around? How do we organize power? All those specifics come once we know what it is that we're looking for. So what is culture? Culture is a tricky thing to define because it's everything. So I think about culture as the shared, learned, integrated, symbolic, adaptive, ever-changing matrix of meaning-making through which we interpret, experience, and survive in the world. Key there is survive in the world. We as humans are not great. We're not the fastest runners, we're not the best climbers, we're not the best swimmers, and we can't fly. So we have a hard time surviving in the physical environment. If we didn't have each other and we didn't have ways of adapting, using our cognitive capacity to adapt to our physical environments as a collective through culture, we as a species, we as a collective, I don't think we'd have a very good chance. So when we're thinking about culture, it is how we assign meaning, it is how we organize ourselves, it is how we make sense of the world around us, and it is how we survive as a collective. So understanding how culture works is about understanding how we survive as a world, as we survive in the world. And also to pay attention to when we are making maladaptive choices. Humans don't always survive in the world. We don't, it's adaptive. We adapt to our physical environments, and sometimes what we do is maladaptive, and they're not great. They're not the best survival strategies. So paying attention to that matters too as anthropologists. And most of the time, culture goes completely unnoticed. It just is. Culture creates the collective common sense ways that we understand, move through, make sense of, and survive in the world. And most of our lives, most of the things that are cultural, we don't experience as cultural, they just are. It just is. So you can also think about culture as that information that's retained in our collective common sense, that knowing nod, that oh yeah, we all just stop at a red light. And we don't think about it as a symbolic, the kind of meaning that's been assigned to red as a color to organize our particular the modes of mobility. We don't think about all the cultural processes involved. We just stop, and then it turns green and we go. And most of how we operate as cultural beings is unnoticed. It goes unnoticed most of the time. So one of our jobs as anthropologists is to draw those moments out and pay attention to them. A great moment when you're thinking anthropologically is whenever you hear the phrase, or that's just natural, it's natural, of course that's just natural. That's a great moment. Whatever it is that's been folded into that expression of it's just, that's just the natural way of things. That's just the natural order of things, or that's just how it is. Anytime that's a normalized, naturalized language, you hear that, is a great moment to grab whatever it is, whatever phenomenon that is that's been normalized and naturalized, and pay attention to how deeply embedded into a collective common sense the specific values, ideas, interests, and meanings they've all become completely embedded, and then it just is. It's just natural. That it just is, right? You just like, oh yeah, that just is. That's how culture works, and we're interested in that. We are interested in those particularly unnoticed articulations of culture and cultural meaning. So we are cultural creatures, we're cultural beings, and we live, experience, and interpret the world through our own particular cultural lens. So one of the things that anthropologists do is we are interested in other cultures. We are interested in how other people in other parts of the world or in other cultural contexts do things. What do people eat? What do people believe? How do they organize themselves? What do they think of as beautiful? What do they think of as wrong? We're curious, for sure. We're curious about others. We are also very, very interested in ourselves. How are we? We as anthropologists in this particular setting are encultured cultural beings as well. We are as culturally embedded as anyone. We all are. So as anthropologists, and because culture goes unnoticed so much of the time, it can be really challenging to anthropologically interrogate our own cultural context, because most of the time we don't even notice it. So we have to really try to tune in. So we can, and one of the ways that we can do that is by looking cross-culturally. So comparing how various cultures understand gender, for example, allows us to see how our own normalized, naturalized, taken for granted, common sense notions of gender and gender binaries and maleness and femaleness, that's a cultural context, an articulation of cultural construction of gender. It's not the only one. And so the value of looking cross-culturally isn't just to sort of investigate some exotic other, and that's the history of anthropology, but we don't now, I don't, as an anthropologist, look at other cultural contexts out of sort of some sort of exotifying curiosity, but rather, what can that tell us? How does that sort of unsettle my own taken for granted, unnoticed cultural notions? And then how can I investigate and interrogate those? And we'll talk a little more in a bit. Throughout the term, we'll offer cross-cultural examples which highlight then, how much of our cultural beinghood we never thought of it before. And hopefully through the term you'll be like, I never thought of that before. Every time you never thought of that before is an example of how culture goes unnoticed so much of the time. So our goal here, as we sort of the art of being human, we're investigating and exploring the art of being human, is to catch those moments of like, I never thought of that. That is what we're going for here. That's what this course is about. And every week I'm going to hammer this list, and we're going to look at examples all the way along. And culture is learned. We are not born knowing how to operate in our cultural contexts, but from the moment we are welcomed into a cultural context, we start to acquire the shared collective common sense knowledge that we need to operate and find our way in that cultural configuration. So we're announced as in a gendered way, boy, girl, pink bonnet, blue bonnet, and we start learning from there. We start getting taught from there how we're supposed to be in accordance with those expectations, with those social roles, with the cultural meanings associated with those. The learning is constant. We learn from our families, we learn from our societies, we learn from our structured institutions, our educational institutions, our cultural institutions, where we learn how to be good, compliant little citizens, where we sit in a row and we can move when the bell goes, and all of that comes out of learning how to be good workers in a capitalist context. It reflects the values, the cultural collective values that are deemed important, that we teach our kids, so that we can have compliant, productive members of the cultural group. What even constitutes productivity, how things are valued, what labor is valued, all of those things we learn and acquire. Even when we learn to acquire our dreams, what are we supposed to dream and aspire to? What do we want for ourselves? What are the markers of success, or what are the markers of happiness or joy? Those are all culturally constructed, and we start internalizing those messages very early on. What do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, so there's a couple things that you got to grow up, and so there's this thing called growing up, and that's kind of rite of passage. And then there's these certain achievements that we should be, aspiring to, which kind of creates a striving, also creates a psychological pressure and stress if we don't quite meet up to those expectations, and this is not what society says I'm supposed to be doing. And all of that is cultural learning. It's shared, meaning we share it. We all stopped at the red light. If only I stopped at the red light and everybody else went through it, it really isn't a working system, right? So we share the collective knowledge that we need to make our way in the world. We individually acquire what we need to know, but it's shared information. So all the babies announced as girls got pink bonnets in a shared way, and symbolically represented. So we share it. It's symbolic in that we symbolically assign meaning to particular kinds of things, like gendered symbols, like we assign some meaning to this thing called money, and then we use that money to do particular kinds of things. It's integrated, so meaning that all the aspects of culture are connected to each other. Our modes of exchange are connected to our political systems, which are connected to our social organization, which are connected to our notions of kinship and gender. It's all connected, and every week I'm going to talk about how culture is integrated. No one cultural form exists in isolation. It's also why it's really important. I'm going to talk in a minute about why, as anthropologists, we need to take a very holistic approach. We need to look at a phenomenon in its entire cultural context. It's not going to make sense if we don't understand it in its integrated entire cultural context. Culture is also constantly changing. It is not static. It's not dynamic. We talked about the shift in language with the technology of phones, and then that changes our modes of communication, and that changes our language. It's always changing. There's new words, there's new concepts, there's new ideas, there's new technologies, new adaptations. It's always changing. So that makes it kind of frustrating to try and capture, like, oh, I want to understand this phenomenon. Oh, and then it's gone. It's this sort of slippery process. But it also makes it really cool and really fun because it's this constantly dynamic, moving thing. And naturalized or unconscious, that is what we just talked about. Most of the time, most of what we know culturally, it goes completely unnoticed. It just is. We just know with these notions of appropriate, notions of morality, what's right, what's wrong. It's just embedded in us. So we learned it, we share it, and then it's just in us. It just becomes our way of being in the world, and we don't think about it. We just do it. Most of what we do as cultural creatures, we just do. We don't think about it. And it's practical. I said we're not very good runners, we're not very good swimmers, we're not very good climbers, and we can't fly. So as humans, we're not very good survivors unless we can adapt to our physical environments as a collective. So it's practical. Culture is practical. It isn't just about assigning meaning for some fanciful reason. It helps us survive. We use it to adapt to our environments to meet our basic needs. It can also be maladaptive. We can exceed the carrying capacities. Maybe a technological innovation means that we can increase our population density to a point that then exceeds or meets the tipping point of our environment's physical capacities. So paying attention to when we are making positive adaptive innovations and when we're making maladaptive ones is important. So we're going to go through this list over and over and over again throughout the term. So whenever, every week, because that is what we're doing here. We are thinking about how culture is the learned, shared, symbolic, integrated, constantly changing, naturalized, and practical, adaptive ways in which we make sense of, interpret, assign meaning, and survive in the world. It defines what's normal, which means it also defines what's not normal or abnormal. In the collective common sense, like, oh, that's just natural, in the knowing nod, also you know they're like, oh, that just is. When something like, oh, that's not right, that's off, that's weird, anything that's like, ew, that's weird, is where culture has assigned a collection of meanings to something that has been normalized, which means it has abnormalized something else. This gets especially important and interesting when we're talking about the assignments of meanings that get organized in hierarchical ways around race, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexuality. And we'll talk about those things later. So it's the taken for granted unconscious ways that we know, understand, and relate to the world and each other. And a lot of the times, too, if you've traveled and you get that feeling of culture shock where you realize that your cultural knowing, your cultural situation and understanding of the world isn't really going to help you navigate a particular context. Maybe because you don't speak the language, maybe because the cultural systems are different, so you can't figure out which bathroom you're supposed to go in or when it's appropriate to do so. Maybe the money looks different or the currency is different and the prices are different. So we don't have to think about it in the context of when you're in your own cultural context. It just is. But you go to a different cultural context and suddenly you don't know what to do because the entire system of meaning making is completely different. So I've just used a couple of images for examples there. So we've talked about what anthropology is, and we've talked about what culture is. So how then do we do cultural anthropology? How do we observe cultural phenomenon that are always changing, that most of the time go unnoticed, as we try and make sense of the ways that humans assign meaning to things, what we're up to. So there's a couple of key ideas and key concepts that help to offer us some vocabulary in thinking about the things that we are trying to think about in this class. The first one is I'm going to go through each of these in more detail. The first of which is that we need to take a holistic approach. If especially we think about how complex culture is as this shared, learned, symbolic, integrated, ever-changing matrix, this dynamic matrix of meaning making, we need to try and investigate whatever cultural phenomenon we're curious about in its entire cultural context. It's part of why anthropological research can take a long time. It takes a while, especially in a different cultural context, to understand what sort of something that might look peculiar on the surface. Like, why are people doing that? That doesn't. What is that about? It makes perfect sense inside that cultural context. We have to get to that place where we understand what that cultural context is. How is that related to and integrated with all of the other kinds of cultural forms and cultural practices that are happening, the other sets of meaning making that are happening that make it relevant, make it logical, and make it meaningful. So it's important that we take a holistic approach. The idea of cultural relativism is really important. We're all cultural creatures. We're all cultural beings. And so when we're looking at a culture, we need to assess it or think about it in its own terms, not our own. I'll explain that a little bit more, as opposed to ethnocentrism, which would be assigning a judgment based on our own cultural context to a different cultural situation. And we do this primarily by way of what's called participant observation. It's one of our primary methodologies. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to have you do some participant observation through the term as you participate and observe in cultural phenomenon, is how we get a sense of it. And then there's this thing called ethnography. Ethnographic research is what cultural anthropologists do. Primarily, it's our participant observation and ethnography is our methodology. And then emic and etic, if we're insiders or outsiders. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit more. So these are the sort of key ideas that give us the vocabulary to actually contemplate how we do this thing called cultural anthropology. So a holistic approach means that we need to understand something within the entire cultural context that it's occurring, especially when something appears weird. And that's those moments, right? That's an ethnocentric assessment when something like, oh, that seems a strange thing for people to be doing. Why are people doing that? That's weird. That's a great time to pay attention to our own cultural values, our own cultural assumptions, our own cultural common sense positionality, and then think about, well, it's entirely logical inside the entire cultural context. So we need to understand the entire cultural context. So a fundamental principle in anthropology is that it requires that all parts of a culture be viewed in the broadest possible context to understand how they are interconnected and how they are interdependent. So that comes back to the idea that culture is integrated. Every aspect or element of culture is integrated. So to understand anything, we need to understand the entire cultural context that makes it meaningful. So earlier I talked about that the Nike commercial, and I'll post a link to it. The relevance and the sort of poignancy of that commercial is contextual, right? Understanding the entire cultural context of what's happening in the United States right now, what's happened in the United States in the last year, in particular around race relations, what's happening politically right now in the United States. Understanding that cultural expression, that moment of cultural expression, that commercial, requires the saliency of it requires understanding the entire cultural context of that makes it meaningful and through which it's getting received and interpreted. When we especially think about how Colin Kaepernick's initial action, his initial choice to take a knee during the national anthem, landed in a very different cultural context. It was very badly received by so many people as an act of hostility. And there was a lot of hostility towards him. So as culture changes, context changes, and we can track that. And that's what we're interested in doing as anthropologists. And we need to do that in the terms of the culture itself. So cultural relativism is one of the fundamental tenets of anthropology, of cultural anthropology, meaning that a cultural system, a belief, a practice, whatever it is that we are studying, needs to be evaluated and analyzed in its own terms, and not the terms of the anthropologist or of another group. That we don't impose our own values, our own cultural systems in trying to assess, or even the word assessment. We're not trying to assess, we're trying to understand. Assess would suggest that we want to judge it when we're trying to understand a cultural phenomenon. So this is really the challenge in this is bracketing out our own cultural positionality, paying attention to our own cultural positionality. And when that's it's going to bias our frame of reference. As we are all biased. We're cultural creatures. We're also deeply biased creatures. So when is that happening, and how is that happening? And you can kind of feel it. You can feel when you have a feeling, or or that that seems wrong. That is where you've assigned a judgment, and where possible, you can pay attention to: am I thinking about this cultural phenomenon in its own terms, or am I assigning my own? Now, this gets really murky when we are often, if we're looking at something that is a human rights violation, we're looking at a practice or something that's going on that seems culturally very logical to, in a particular context, like, in a cultural context that has decided that one particular group of people needs to be exterminated by way of genocide. And so if we were to sort of be purely culturally relativistic, we would say, oh, that's, in its own terms, that's its own thing. It's not up to me to apply my judgment or assessment on that. Cultural relativism doesn't mean that. When we're talking about human rights violations, we're talking about advocacy and activism. We engage more. That's sort of the moral order, and we are engaging it. What we need to do is, though, be very aware of how we're doing it, and be aware of when we're assigning a moral valuation on the practices of others. We can't just never do it, and we can't just do it selectively. We need to be mindful. Am I imposing my views, or am I understanding what's happening in real time. I don't know how many of you, or if any of you have watched the movie The Angry and Nook. Is a great example of when. So it's a beautiful film about the seal hunt. The seal hunt, as a cultural practice, an invaluable cultural practice of a subsistence strategy for many, anyway, since time immemorial, where that got imposed on it an incredible load of ethnocentric judgment and banning and rules, and the sort of the international conservation movement to save the baby seals that had no understanding of the importance and the value and the process of the seal hunt for the Inuit. That film, if you have a chance to take a look at it, when you're watching it, think about cultural relativism there, and so it's tricky because cultural relativism in practice is a lot harder. It sounds great on a slide. It's hard to do in practice, and we're going to sort of work through some examples of that as we go through the term, because sometimes bad things are happening. Sometimes people are being harmed. And one of our other tenets in anthropology is that what we do doesn't cause harm. And so we have to be sort of engaging in that moral question all the time as well, as is the case in any research. Right? Research and curiosity and inquiry about the world is a moral process, and a certainly morally resonant one. But in broad strokes, when we think about doing anthropology, we're thinking about trying to understand a cultural phenomenon. We want to think of it in a holistic way, and we want to attend to it in its own terms, in its own cultural terms. And we don't get to that holistic view if we don't situate what's happening in its own terms. As opposed to ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is where you are evaluating or studying and judging another culture from the perspective of your own, where you're imposing your own cultural values and judgments on another, where you see a cultural phenomenon, you see things that a group is doing, and you assess them as wrong or immoral or gross or weird, and you're doing that without acknowledging that your cultural positionality is informing and framing that bias. So when we sort of put that to some of those moments on the ground where there might be harm doing, there might be a violation of human rights, or there might be violence, and our desire, we want to intervene we don't want that violence to continue. First, we have to understand what's happening and why it's happening, and then we can sort of figure out what's the best way to intervene. So the sort of murky relationship between cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, the way we navigate that murkiness is through self-reflection, self-awareness, and positioning ourselves as anthropologists in the work we're doing. That we acknowledge that we are biased, we are our own biased and cultured creatures, coming to these inquiries, coming to this we're sort of interested in what people are doing and why they're doing it, and that is a murky, complicated, morally loaded process. And if we were in class, I'd say, anybody have any questions? And then we'd have a cool conversation about human rights violations and cultural practices, but we aren't. So we'll save that for we aren't in class. So we can have those kinds of conversations in seminar, because it's one thing to explain things on a slide. It's quite another to think, okay, well, in real time, in real life, like, what does that actually look like? That seems a little bit more complicated, and it is always a little bit more complicated. And so what we do, how we do it, is called ethnography. So ethnography, or ethnographic research, is how we do anthropology, cultural anthropology often. We also do other things. We do sort of content analysis. You might watch movies or look at art or read literature. We look at cultural productions, right? The material cultural productions. And we engage with people. We watch and engage and listen to what people are up to. And we talk to people. So we do ethnographic research, and then the way what we write is called an ethnography as well. So ethnographies are collections of descriptive material about a culture. So when you've sort of done ethnographic field work, and then you write an ethnography, so you're doing the field work, you're out there, that's the ethnographic process, the method, and then you write an ethnography. So that's the descriptive telling, the dissemination, the descriptive telling of the story. There's also ethnographic film. There's ethnographic photography. It's not just in written prose that ethnography can get articulated. So it's both the method that we use and the thing that we produce. So if you hear the word ethnography, or you read something that's an ethnographic account, it's the descriptive telling, the descriptive dissemination of somebody's observations of a cultural context or a cultural phenomenon. And there's two ways that we two approaches, two sort of positions when we're doing ethnography, and they are emic and etic. So if you are doing emic, and I'm putting these words out there so that when you hear them, you know what they mean. So emic is the research that you would do, and you are of your own cultural group. You're an insider, and you are doing you're curious about something in your own cultural context. Etic is when you are an outsider, and it's very interesting. And I'm going to ask you to start to ponder when it is beneficial to be an insider and when it is beneficial to be an outsider. So the challenges of being an insider is that you are in your own cultural context, and culture goes unnoticed most of the time. So you really won't notice. It can take a while for you to start to realize, like, oh, that's a whole bunch of cultural assumptions that I'm making. So I'm not even noticing what's going on because I'm in it. I'm embedded in it, and it's unconscious. We're all sharing the same common sense, so we're not sort of critically evaluating anything. So it can pose its own challenges, but it also means you are, as an insider, you may have access to particular sets of relationships that would just be unavailable to an outsider. An outsider is a stranger. If you are interested in the sort of particular inner workings of a religious organization that you are a part of, and you wouldn't do, so there's ethical considerations. I'm going to talk about the ethics in a bit, but you can't do this kind of research without everybody knowing that you're doing it. You can't be a stealth anthropological spy. That would be unethical. When you're doing this kind of research, everybody around you needs free, informed, and prior consent. Everybody needs to know what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're going to do with the information. And those research relationships are negotiated constantly. We work with communities. We don't sort of sit back and like observe them like some omnipotent, like all-knowing ethnographic voice and expert. So if you have permission, you're inside the group, you want to look at some particular kind of, maybe the way that a particular religious organization mobilizes community outreach work, for example. How do they get people to care about the community, or what kinds of things do they do, or who do they help, or why do they do it, or and you're inside it and you're in it, and that's a good. You're positioned. You're well positioned to do that kind of work. So the challenge is identifying your own biases and situating yourself in your own positionality. Cultural relativism, ethnocentrism, holistic, that can be a bit murky when you're an insider, and you also have access to, so once you dial into it, the whole holistic context might be able to, you would put it together a lot quicker than if you were an outsider once you start paying attention to it. And you have access to the particular kinds of relationships for particular kinds of research that you might want to do. As an outsider, there are times where you may be called in, you may be asked to come. Like, we need an outside set of eyes on this. We're trying to figure out a problem, or we're trying to figure out what to do here. What does an outsider think who doesn't have a background in all of the cultural context? So doesn't have, it'll take some time, it'll take to get a sense, to understand it. But what you don't have as an outsider is that existing common sense, unnoticed bias. So sometimes outside research offers a particular perspective that is unique and helpful. But other times it's not, some research isn't yours to do. If you are not a member of the group, those are not your questions to ask. That's not your business. And as an anthropologist, as a researcher, if it's not your business, it's not your business. It doesn't matter how interested you are in something. If somebody doesn't want to talk to you about it, or it's not appropriate to talk to you about it, then we have an ethical responsibility to back down on that. So how the kind of research that you do is very dependent on the question, on the context, on what you're researching, why you're doing it, all of those things. And then, so the question itself, the anthropology, the ethnographic inquiry emerges out of the phenomenon or the question itself, and then who does it, whose is it to do, how does that happen? That emerges out of the question itself. And how can that happen in an ethical way? So ethically, is everybody informed? Does everybody understand what I'm doing and what I'm going to do with the information? If you are asking people to disclose very personal information to you, you need to be very clear about how you're going to protect their confidentiality and their anonymity, who is going to have access to that information, and how you're going to move that out into the world. How are you going to turn that into writing an ethnography when you're asking people very personal things? Also, I lost my train of thought. Never mind. It'll come back. All right, and how we do it, one of the primary methods is called participant observation. So this is a method of learning a people's culture through direct observation and participation in everyday life. So this is when I said earlier, we watch and we listen. We would never record, ethically, you would never record something, a phenomenon, without people's full knowledge and written and consent, full informed consent. So you wouldn't videotape anyone, you wouldn't tape record anyone, you wouldn't photograph anyone without their knowledge and without their consent, that they understand exactly what you're doing. Oftentimes, part of our participant observation is interviews. We chat with people. Sometimes formal interviews, some more informal conversations, sometimes with some guiding questions. We're curious about something. We ask some probing questions. You wouldn't interview somebody without them knowing you were interviewing them, and you certainly wouldn't video or audio record them without them knowing. We have a responsibility we're interested in the experience of being human, and we are interested in it in a way that does no harm. The other thing, I don't know what I was going to say, that we want to be very mindful of is that we are never putting people at risk. And so people may tell us things that are confidential or that could put them at risk. Ways that people, this is especially for anthropologists who are working with in situations where there's resistance, movements of resistance. So in oppressive situations where how are people circumnavigating structures of oppression? How are people moving refugees across borders? How are people managing political threat? What they tell you, if you are lucky, if you are honored to be gifted people's trust to tell you about how they're actually managing and navigating in what can be horrific, violent, and threatening situations, you are holding their lives in your hands. We have to hold that as so precious, as the precious, generous gift of people sharing their experiences with us. And so you could probably become a really famous hotshot anthropologist by telling some sexy stories about the movement of refugees from one place to another, or the organ. There's been some really fascinating work done in the organ harvesting and illegal organ trade of refugees, for example, or illegal, undocumented migrants who really don't exist, and so are extremely vulnerable to that kind of predatory exploitation. If you are putting people at risk by doing so, it is unethical and you are causing harm. So as we sort of find our way as anthropologists, we are drawn to the human experience. We are we're on the side of humans in broad strokes, which means that everything we do needs to be situated in that intention, and we need to be. This is the cultural relativism, ethnocentrism, and moral waters that we need to tread as we are doing the doing of anthropology. So this is a lighter example of ethnography. It is not about the illegal harvesting and illegal organ trade of undocumented migrants around the world. Although that is some brilliant and fascinating work that people are doing, and incredibly important work that people are doing in that area. But this is an example of, and I've put the link of this one, so I'll put the link to the Colin Kaepernick Nike commercial. And then this is it's an older video now, but it's really still quite relevant. It's by an anthropologist who does digital anthropology. So his field work is online. He's interested in digital communities. And this is an anthropology of YouTube. So he's looking at YouTube communities, the formation of YouTube communities, and how YouTube, the spread of cultural ideas across YouTube, across the culturescape of YouTube. And it's great. It's a great example of doing ethnography. Doing ethnography doesn't mean that where the field is, doesn't mean you go off to some far off land. It doesn't mean you go downtown to some other kind of neighborhood. It can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you even have to leave your house. Everything around us is culture, including the mediascapes, the social mediascapes, and the platforms, the digital platforms across which we interact and make the world meaningful. So YouTube is one of them. So there's a good example. I was trying to find stuff on the anthropology of TikTok because as a cultural phenomenon, I don't understand TikTok. So I was hoping that there was some anthropology, some ethnographers that could offer us some insight into this phenomenon. So perhaps some of you want to take that on as your, future, because I don't get it. I'm watching my son all on the TikTok, and so we can talk about TikTok later. This one's about YouTube. So, and then as we wrap it up, I want you to consider what is anthropology, and starting to think about how might anthropology be relevant? These are the kinds of questions I'm going to have you thinking about in advance of your first assignment to get you sort of ready. So you can start to make some notes and think about how might it be relevant or important to understanding a real life situation. What might anthropology broadly, as the study of human, the experience of being human, and then specifically cultural anthropology, where can you see it, something around you, some question you might have around you? Think, anthropology might be one of the ways that we could get at understanding that a little better, whatever it is. So just start thinking about things you're interested in and how anthropology may land as fitting that curiosity, and then let's start sort of paying attention to what culture is. Let's consider examples of how it is shared, learned, symbolic, adaptive, always changing, integrated, and goes unnoticed most of the time. So you can just start jotting things down when you think of shared a shared moment, a sort of shared cultural notion. Maybe you just notice something in your household that you set the table tonight for dinner and the fork went on the left and you never even really thought about why that is. There's a shared cultural meaning. I don't know why that is. My grandmother taught me to do it and I always forgot. I can never remember, but why does the fork go on the left? And that's something called manners, and that's something that's shared. It's culturally completely constructed and totally arbitrary. How is it learned? How did I learn that the fork was on the left? How is it symbolic? It's symbolic of proper etiquette and manners. Well, what does that even mean? Which is reflective of the class system, which speaks to how it's integrated, how culture is integrated, how it's adaptive. We adapt to our physical environments. How do you adapt? How do you use culture to adapt? That will probably make more sense after next week's lecture when we talk about subsistence strategies. How is it changing? How is it always changing? I'll be interested if you watch the YouTube video about YouTube. Okay? What's different now about YouTube than when? This is when the group is sort of a class, a digital anthropology class that launched fieldwork together on YouTube. YouTube has changed significantly, as has the way we interact on YouTube. Changed significantly. And then start paying attention to how culture goes unnoticed most of the time. Do you have little moments where they come along and be like, oh, yeah, there, I never thought of that, but there it is. There's like a cultural moment. It's sort of where that knowing nod turns a little like, oh yeah, I get it, right? So let's start making some notes on and some examples of how culture is shared, learned, symbolic, adaptive, always changing, integrated, and goes unnoticed most of the time. And then we'll think about these bigger ideas: holistic approach, cultural relativism and ethnocentrism, participant observation, and ethnography. We'll just keep floating those ones out there. Again, those are kind of abstract. They make more sense in practice. Just sort of let those start to swirl around. I'm most interested this week in you thinking through some of these examples. Just start noticing them around you as you're moving through the world. Those especially, symbolic is easy. The money, fashion, the signs that we see, the signs that stand in for something, right? But you just know what it means, but it doesn't say explicitly. Think about those kinds of cultural symbols. And I really appreciate your time and patience this week. I hope you are faring well. I look forward to seeing you in seminar. And let me know if you have any questions. I have office hours on Thursday. Thanks so much. Take good care. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. And I will talk to you soon. Bye.